Hi, it's Jenny Lamorgan from Lean Into Green, and I'm excited to be with my guest today, Dr. Asoka Bandarage. I'm going to talk a little bit about who she is and why you want to listen to her and the impact she's going to have on your life. But first, before we get started, I want to share a little bit about Lean Into Green for those of you listening for the first time. I'm a green entrepreneur and owner of greenwomanstore.com. And I'm always looking for new ways to go greener. And I've learned so much from these interviews with these green lifestyle experts that I know you'll be glad you've joined us. You will learn how going green enriches our lives, our health, our wealth, and our happiness in so many inspiring ways. Lean Into Green is about learning from some of the best experts in this field. So let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Asoka Bandarage. She is an author, a professor, a researcher, and policy analyst. She has most recently authored Sustainability and Well-Being, The Middle Path to Environment, Society, and the Economy. She has taught at universities and colleges around the world, and her research interests include social philosophy and consciousness, environmental sustainability, human well-being and health, global politics and economics, ethnicity and gender, population and social movements, and Southeast Asia. Welcome, Dr. Bandarage. Thank you for joining our Lean Into Green Telesummit. We are so glad to have you with us today.
Thank you so much for having me on your show. It's a great pleasure and privilege.
Thank you for your really good work. I'm excited to talk to you today. You write and you teach about well-being that includes the physical, the mental, the spiritual, and the environmental for the larger community, the world. We humans are part of nature, definitely. So please tell us about your research work on sustainability and well-being.
Yes, briefly put, what I try to do is to synthesize a social science analysis with a broader a spiritual and philosophical perspective and what is going on in the world. So it's very much an integrative and holistic approach. And when it comes to environmental sustainability and human well-being, we can't approach these as two separate issues because we are part of nature and we have to live within this planetary ecosystem. So we have to approach human well-being and environmental sustainability in an integrated way, both in terms of understanding the problems we are seeking as well as their transformation, because much of it lies in the trajectory of social and economic development that we are on now. And in order to change that trajectory, we have to change our consciousness. And those are the kinds of broad issues that I deal with in my latest book, Sustainability and Well-Being. And, I can talk more specifically about the issues I take up in the book as we go along in this interview.
Well, let's start with talking about the connection between environmental well-being and our health.
Yes. A lot of the people concerned with the climate crisis or biodiversity loss or nitrogen pollution, those are the planetary boundaries that we have already surpassed, tend to overlook the human dimensions or see them as separate issues in terms of the impact of so-called environmental disasters like frequent floods, earthquakes, but we have to look at them as interrelated. And also, what we don't really see as environmental issues, for example, poverty, loss of livelihoods, are also very much connected to the environmental collapse. So environmental and social collapse are interlinked. And so that's why something like an environmental justice movement is really important in lieu of the simply an environment or social change movements. And I think there is a growing consciousness of this interrelatedness and a recognition that in order to change our way of living that we also have to change our thinking and question the dominant assumptions about what it means to be human or what is nature as opposed to what is human.
And definitely to rethink our being part of nature. We've spent millennia separating ourselves from nature for sure.
Right, and for example, take something like pollution. The water, the air, the soil, across the planet is increasingly polluted. So that's not just an environmental issue. If you look at its connection to industrialization of agriculture and how that impacts on human health, the massive use of agrochemicals, pesticide, and how that is causing kidney disease, cancer, so on and so forth. For example, in places like Sri Lanka, there is evidence that the massive use of agrochemicals has caused chronic kidney disease, particularly among the agricultural populations. And that is also the case in other agricultural communities in Nicaragua, India, so on and so forth. And same thing with the water pollution. Over 1/3 of the population in the world don't have access to clean and safe water. So it's not just an environmental issue, it is a human health issue, an issue of human well-being.
Well, it certainly affects our families and our populations in a really big way. And I don't think that we've done a lot of the research in this country connecting the use of pesticides with, directly with the health issues that you've been able to, through your research, to connect in other countries. I know you've just returned from Sri Lanka.
Yes, I think what is happening is there are so many issues in the world, from various kinds of diseases like this chronic kidney disease, the lack of access to clean water, poverty, loss of livelihood, not only for people in the global south, but in the global north, not only for poor, marginalized communities, but middle class individuals. Then, the whole gamut of so-called environmental issues, from deforestation to climate change, so on and so forth. So I think that we are at a point where it is difficult to take up these issues individually, that we have to see how it is connected to this particular way of living on the planet and the social hierarchies that we have created and the extremist model of economic and technological growth that we are pushing. And it is not to say that there shouldn't be any material growth or economic expansion or technological expansion, but it is taken to an extreme degree where we are now talking about post-nature, post-human world. And this is not just science fiction, as I discuss in my book. There are leading scientists and institutions that are actually talking about technological singularity, integration of life on the planet through technology and market, and that having a sort of a dynamic of its own at the expense of human interconnectedness in terms of social connection and emotional connection. So I think what we need is not a complete renunciation of technology and entrepreneurship, because we need that, but to have a more balanced approach where we look at ourselves as human beings and look at our basic needs rather than sort of pushing this greed and wanting for material goods, because that is what the economic system is constantly pushing. So I think that we have to come to a greater wisdom of what it means to be human and put more emphasis and energy on our inner development, our spiritual development, and our interconnectedness before things fall apart even more.
And you've talked about some of the worst, the science going in the farthest direction away from connectedness and interconnectedness. Do you see strategies for environment and development coming out of international organizations, UN Development Organization, those kinds of and NGOs that are more whole in their approaches to development strategies. Do you see anything at that level that seems promising?
Yes, I think that there are a lot of very promising developments, and unfortunately, they don't get enough attention and support, particularly in the mainstream media, in terms of solar energy, renewable sources of energy, reduced consumption, and I think in some other countries, there have been even greater efforts in this regard. And there are many grassroots groups working towards these things: community-based housing, cutting back on, unnecessary consumption. They may not always come from the highest echelons of power, but I think that there are enough institutions, organizations, and individuals working towards that, and they need to be more connected with a more integrated philosophy and the conscious change in consciousness, which is necessary before we can implement policy changes. And I think that there's got to be much more wider participation among people and a sort of questioning where we are headed, because I think that there is a lot of fear in the part of individuals about their own their survival. Can I pay my mortgage, or can I find a job when I graduate from college or high school? And I think that has fragmented people and separated them from each other, and it feeds into the individualistic competitive ethic. And I think it's important to sort of see the collective dilemma that we are facing, and also its relationship to environmental survival, because with the environment collapsing, how are we going to survive as a species? So I think that it's a time where we need to sort of stop and question and look at the conditioned patterns of our own thinking, where we have accepted, certain trajectory of evolution as a given rather than as human created, and therefore that we also have the capacity to make certain changes, not, necessarily violent revolution, but a change that comes from a deeper understanding of survival. And I think that there are efforts, and the kind of work that you are doing to bring these to light and to engage more people in this conversation, I think is a part of that movement.
And thank you for that. And I think that there's so much being done at the United Nations level with sustainable development and environmental policies, but we just don't have an opportunity to get involved and to really encourage our legislative leaders to take these strategies on as national strategies. So many nations around the world are dipping their toes into these kinds of development issues and moving in the right direction. And I just think the work that so many are doing. I've interviewed, so many on this Lean into Green program, and it's so promising. There's so much being done out there that's going in the right direction, and so many young people getting involved. Do you find that young people are bringing some new energy and new solutions?
Yes, I think in terms of the climate change issue, organizations like 350.org, which is trying to bring down, carbon emissions, which is at a critical point, that's been a very inspiring movement. And these are not, high-powered professionals necessarily. They are, oftentimes young people from around the world, who are taking up this issue and to to bring that to the forefront, particularly around issues like the Keystone Pipeline in the United States, is really important, because I think it is this combination of political and economic power that is sort of stopping attention to the grassroots and global movements for change and for environmental sustainability. So that's where, the issues of social inequality, power inequalities are also very much a part of this struggle for sustainability, and it's very difficult to separate them out because these are also sort of political and economic struggles. And the very promising thing about the environmental movement is that it is a nonviolent movement, at least so far, but if it's not, if environment collapse becomes worse, for example, people not having enough water to drink, and there are water wars, more conflicts over basic resources like water, things, even environmental efforts could become violent. But before we get to that point, we have to use the space and opportunities that we have now to create this global consciousness and integrated efforts, which, as you point out, need to bear on policymaking at the national and international level, particularly with regard to, say, the Keystone Pipeline issue in the United States and the Kyoto protocols at the level of the United Nations and the global level. So, but I think these have to be, informed through changes of individual consciousness and people taking time to think about these issues as also personal issues, that these are not sort of political issues separate from our own lives.
That's right. And you've talked a little bit about poverty and the loss of livelihood due to the climate collapse and climate change. Can you tell us what you've discovered about the middle path to economics and how environmental well-being affects our individual wealth as well as national wealth?
Yes, I've drawn the concept of middle path from the Buddhist teachings, although I think it's a much wider concept than that, that has universal applicability. It comes from the Buddha's own life, where he understood from personal experience that neither extreme of self-indulgence or self-denial was the path to enlightenment or happiness, but it is a more of the middle path, the balanced path of patience, tolerance. And I found that in the process of doing this research on global sustainability and well-being, that this teaching of the middle path is not just simply applicable to the individual level, but we can also apply it to the larger social and political economic levels. For example, in terms of reconstructing the model of economic development, which is the model that we are on now is a sort of unbridled economic growth and technological growth, which does not necessarily take into account environmental, social, ethical criteria. So that is one extreme. And the other extreme is, some radical environmentalists would call for no growth and almost harking back to a static, pre-modern kind of position, which a lot of poor people don't want. They also want development. They want electricity. They want infrastructure. So it's to move away from the two extremes of either excessive, unbridled growth, sort of without questioning the means and the ends on the one hand, or the no growth, static position. But how do we find a balanced path? And both in terms of consumption and production. How do we introduce ethical, environmental, social criteria at the outset social meaning that we take into account the needs of all groups of people, not the tiny elite like, the so-called 1%, but the people, who don't have access to water and food and sources of survival. So both in terms of, so the distribution issue becomes very critical in terms of rational allocation of resources in a more just way. And also in terms of production, there's got to be certain limits placed, which is not to say that it is necessarily anti-capitalist, because I think the problem is the kind of capitalism we have now, which is monopolistic capitalism. There are a few large corporations control every sector of production and actually wiping out small entrepreneurs who find it very difficult to survive, and this has become a global phenomenon. And that also affects livelihoods, because the commitment is not to environmental sustainability or providing livelihoods for people, but towards the bottom line of the profit. So that's where, I think the middle path comes in. But in order to get to social policies in that direction, I think that we have to also experience an inner transformation, making a distinction between our wants and needs. What are basic needs as human beings? Certainly physical needs of, food and water and health, care and education and skills. But so much of what we think we need are actually excessive wants that have been created by the sort of the market and technological growth model. So, but how can we have a more balanced approach where we make our social needs, emotional needs also important? Because I think that there is a lot of fragmentation, loneliness, despair in the world. It's not just the physical deprivation characterized by poverty and loss of livelihood, but also a lot of mental, psychological ill health. And that's where the issue of happiness comes in, and wealth is not just material wealth, but emotional well-being. And as human beings, we need to be connected. And the kind of connectedness that comes from technology is one thing, and it is very useful, but how can we balance that with, new ways of building community, where people have a greater sense of collective participation in life. And I think there are a lot more people thinking about these issues, and it's not easy to transform them into action, but we have to start somewhere. So, I wrote this book as a small contribution to broadening the discourse, on these issues. So it's not just this very narrow perspective on happiness that is available in the global north, but how that is also related to alleviation of poverty and environmental sustainability, and how all these issues are very much integrated, and how we need a sort of a different social philosophy that should become the dominant one as opposed to the one that seems to be prevailing right now.
And I think we need more examples of the wholeness of the whole picture of our lives, our health, our wealth, our happiness, the environmental wellness. How we are all connected. And we're connected to nature. And you speak about and you write about moving from a worldview of domination from domination to one of partnership. And that partnership with nature is certainly an ancient worldview that religions older than 4,000 to 5,000 years old they hold, and certainly the view of indigenous peoples around the world. So to me, it feels like we're coming full circle with our ancient sustainability, those spiritual roots that we all held globally in the past. Does it seem that way to you when you do your research, that we're kind of coming full circle here? We lived sustainably on this planet for millennia before the last several thousand years. So when we started to have that concept of humanity having power over nature, and now I think we're finally, with climate change, we're realizing, that how false that is.
Right, and I think that the systems of, both domination thinking and partnership thinking have always been there. As human beings, we have a sort of a whole continuum of emotions and thoughts and so on. But this sense of dualism, of the separation between self and other, has become overpowering in recent decades and centuries, particularly with the expansion of technology and the market system, where we feel that, through those that we can conquer nature, whereas earlier that, we were more a part of nature. But this is not a thinking that is peculiar to the modern era. This dualistic thinking has been there from the beginning, but because of the material circumstances, people had to rely more on each other, so that there was a greater interdependence, which is not to say that there weren't, social hierarchies and forms of exploitation in pre-modern times, particularly if you look at, say, the oppression of women. So the both systems of thinking have been there, and even today the partnership thinking is very much there, without which families and communities would not survive, particularly if we look at the work that women do, the unpaid work as the nurturers of families and the elderly, so on and so forth, that very much comes from that sense of partnership and compassion. It is there, but it is not really valued so much. And also during times of crisis, like, for example, during the tsunami that hit Sri Lanka and other Asian countries at the end of 2004, there was an outpouring of global sympathy, support, and aid, and for a moment it seemed like the world came together, even warring factions, soldiers and rebel groups, they were jumping into the water trying to save people, who are drowning, not thinking of which ethnic group or political faction they belong to, So there is that is always there, but how can we honor that and strengthen that? Because right now what we are rewarding is that extremist, individualistic, competitive aspects of ourselves rather than the compassionate, collectivist aspects. And so I think that we have to consciously honor that, develop that, and make that stronger and translate that into policy making, and particularly in terms of influencing the political system, which is around the world controlled by handful of people who are backed by big money. So in terms, and that's why this effort is also part of a struggle for democracy and popular participation.
And you speak about women's kind of collective consciousness and certainly a more relational approach to human life. Do you think that women have a uniquely important role in changing societies from the grassroots up? Certainly, the more women that participate at the legislative level, we see changes. But I think that women are really rising around the world. Do you see that as being important in this shift toward partnership?
Yeah, I think so. I try to be careful, not to sort of see women as nature and men as culture, kind of a dualism, because we are all part of nature. But the fact is, yes, women are the nurturers around the world, and women have a sort of a greater, a closer relationship to provision of resources, whether it is providing the water, the firewood, growing the food for families and so on and so forth, so that there is perhaps an experiential understanding of the importance of the environment and environmental sustainability. but I think, and also, there have been movements to protect the forests, natural resources in which women are oftentimes the leaders. But at the same time, I think we have to not put the burden entirely on women like, certain theorists and institutions try to do, but at this, to recognize the important role that women play, but to also see this as a collective struggle as humanity.
And all of our responsibility to step up and rise up,
Yes,
for sure.
absolutely. And I think, it really starts with sort of questioning our assumptions and questioning the dominant culture and the values, and which is not to, as I said before, not to decry the importance of material goods and services and certain comforts and conveniences, that we all enjoy, but to see that that it's been taken to an extremist level, and that is not the only aspect of life, and that it is, been taken to such an extreme that technology is taking a life of its own and making human beings dispensable. This is sort of not just far-fetched. It's already beginning to happen in terms of, our sort of servitude to technology rather than technology and the market, which are means for human satisfaction, that we should have, a greater say on how we use these media.
Science, not just for the sake of science. We've certainly seen some of that.
Right. And it's not easy, particularly with regard to things like genetic engineering, what is the sort of cutoff in terms of, what is ethical, what is needed. But we do need, greater discourse about these things, and that's where the issue of values come in, Is it simply for profit? Because science doesn't have a life of its own. It's also driven by corporate profit-making. So, all these issues are so interconnected that, we also have to have a more integrated philosophy in terms of questioning them and moving to a different way of being in the world, where we have this great technology and the market mechanisms, but we also put greater emphasis on, the development of our other attributes, which are, I think, being undermined. If you look at sort of levels of political corruption all around the world, and it's not particular to any country or any political party, it's excessive, and it doesn't inspire young people, because it makes them feel that they have to sort of play the same game in order to survive, because those who are making the sacrifices and trying to live in a more ethical way are not being rewarded, but those who are sort of manipulating the system and, engaged in unethical behaviors are seemingly prospering. So I think there's a fundamental ethical dimension to the issues of human well-being and environmental sustainability.
Thank you for that. And I'm a feminist, and I see feminism as benefiting everybody. It certainly is not limited to benefiting women. In the 1980s, you were speaking about a feminist worldview and global agenda for peace and development. And I know at that time, women were afraid of the word feminist, to bring it up in meetings, because they would lose support for their projects, financial support, and even for their nation's development projects. So my question today is, how is feminism playing out as we're moving from domination to partnership, and is it an effective worldview for sustainability around the world? Because you travel and you see a lot.
Yeah, because, there are sort of contradictory developments with regard to women's position in the world. On the one hand, you do see women more in the public sphere, doing well in terms of professions, not so much in the political spheres, but, in the private corporate sector, governmental sectors, so on and so forth. But at the same time, the level of violence against women is also on the rise in some of these same countries where women are seemingly doing well professionally. For example, in India, there have been many cases of rape, which have come to light in recent years. Also in Sri Lanka, in many war zones in the Middle East, so on and so forth. So the issue of women's oppression and violence against women is certainly not a thing of the past. It's very much alive, and also, immigrant women who go to work as housemaids from, say, Asian countries, to work in the Middle East, they've experienced sort of incredible abuse and violations. So these issues are very much alive, and they need to be addressed, and we have to have that gender-based perspective. But at the same time, we have to sort of question just a liberal feminist perspective, that has traditionally talked about integrating women into the system rather than sort of questioning what is the system, the political economic system itself that needs to be changed. And I think those issues come up when we look at the environmental collapse and economic collapse and social collapse. Is there really room for integration of women and larger groups into a system that is collapsing, or should we really talk about restructuring the system in which, women and other groups have, greater access, and their perspectives and experiences are also taken into account?
And I think entrepreneurship is changing the face of the world, as well as small businesses are rising with a different approach to manufacturing and definitely more sustainable business practices. Mm-hmm. So mm-hmm. I think that when you talk about the economy and entrepreneurship being important, certainly in our changing
yes.
times.
Right, in terms of renewable sources of energy, in terms of organic agriculture, which has become really an important issue around the world, given the level of, as I said, agrochemicals and pesticides use and the health problems that have been created by that. And most of those kinds of initiatives are taken by small entrepreneurs and community-based organizations and groups. So, it's not like there isn't room for growth. There's really room for new technological breakthroughs, in terms of new forms of sustainable forms of energy, sustainable agriculture, new forms of sort of community-based living, shared transportation, and it can be very exciting. But we have to sort of shift our thinking from this very individualistic, competitive framework to something that is more collectivist. There is no room for each individual on the planet to own and operate their own vehicle, although it seems that's what's happening in places like India and China and so on. Mm-hmm. But if we had more efficient, reliable, sustainably used transportation, public transportation, it can also be much more socially connecting. the sustainability, environmental sustainability and social well-being, they go sort of hand in hand. And I think that one example of transportation, can be used to illustrate the great possibilities for that, rather than, just this the current model. And, I was just in India and Sri Lanka both, and, it's difficult to get around because there's so much traffic, and even in small spaces, there are just so many cars, and it takes sometimes hours to get from one block to the other because of the traffic jams, and it just doesn't make much sense. But that is what is thought of as development and progress, So forests are being cut down, and the sort of new highways are being built, and lots of cars are being imported, and people are, spending a lot of money, trying to get the latest model of cars, and that's seen as sort of the road to development and growth, without sort of looking at the downside of that, and also considering other ways of addressing need for transportation.
Well, I think that you really help us to integrate all of the different pieces, because, we hear a lot about this issue and that issue, but they're not often woven together so that we can see how one touches another and how they all touch our lives. So we thank you very much for all your good work and for joining us today as we all lean in a little deeper into our green lifestyles. And we don't get very much news about development issues and environmental issues from around the world. So again, we thank you very much for sharing with us some of your recent travels, and the research that you do benefits all of us. So we're appreciative of your book, and you can find out more about Dr. Asoka Bandarage and buy her new book, Sustainability and Well-Being, The Middle Path to Environment, Society, and the Economy. And you can buy it at her website, bandarage.com. That's BANDARAGE.com. She has books and articles, and we're going to provide you with a link for those. And also a guest lecture that she did, there's a video. And you can also join Dr. Bandarge on Facebook, and we'll give you that link as well. Thank you again, Asoka, very much for joining us and enlightening us.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. And we hope that Dr. Bandarge's words have inspired you and have you feeling hopeful for our world going forward and sustainably. Keep listening as we all lean into green a little deeper on our collective quest towards sustainability. Bye for now.